In this segment, we're going to look at the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle, as part of photosynthesis. This is the honors bonus material on respiration and photosynthesis. I always like to start with this slide because it shows an overview of what is going on inside the chloroplast. You can see that the reactions are divided into two parts, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle, also known as the light-independent reactions, once referred to as the dark reactions. We now call them light-independent reactions of the Calvin cycle. You can see that light energy is coming in on this side, along with water, which isn't shown on the diagram, but it's coming in to the light-dependent reactions. And the energy from light and the electrons from the water are used to generate ATP and NADP+. We're familiar with ATP from our bioenergetics unit in the past as a nucleic acid that is used as an energy source for cellular reactions. And NADPH is an electron carrier, which is also in the same family as ATP. And its job is to carry electrons from a place where they're produced to a place where they can be used. In this case, it would be the Calvin cycle. And on the top side of this, we see cycling out NADP+, which is an electron carrier that needs to get reloaded. It doesn't have its electron on it anymore. And ADP and inorganic phosphate, and that's the form of ATP like we talked about in the last unit, that needs to get recharged. And that will get recharged again in the light-dependent reactions, and that will continue. On the Calvin cycle side of the reaction, we have carbon dioxide coming in, and we have sugars going out. So that's an overview, and I like to use that as a starting point and a reference point throughout, and then I like to go back to it at the end just to make sure that I got everything that's going on. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at the light-dependent reactions. They're divided into two groups, photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, and then an electron transport chain. And I'll talk about those in a diagram. These particular slides are there just for purposes of your studying them. So again, we'll see all of these things in this diagram. All right, so what we see is a close-up of the thylakoid membrane. On the top side, we see the thylakoid interior space. That would be inside that little pancake inside the thylakoid. And then we see outside the thylakoid, which is still inside of the chloroplast, and that area is called the stroma. This is a plasma membrane that we've seen before, and we'll see again in Unit A.4 in a lot of detail. These are phospholipids with the phosphate head and the fatty acid tails, just like we see in lots of membrane-bound structures. And then we see these proteins that are integrated into the membrane. Some of them are acting in the two photosystems, some of them are acting in electron transport chains, and some of them are acting as molecules that are used to generate ATP, also known as ATP synthase. At the beginning of this reaction, we see water molecules are getting broken by chlorophyll in photosystem 2 using the energy from photons or light. And what we're getting is some oxygen. For every molecule of water that gets broken up, we get 1/2 of an O2 molecule. So for every 2 water molecules, we get 1 O2 molecule. And then for every water molecule, we get 2 protons or hydrogen nuclei, and we get 2 electrons. And those electrons are what we're really going to be using in the first part of this reaction as an energy source to pump protons across the thylakoid membrane from the stroma on the inside to the inner thylakoid space, and that will build up a surplus of electrons on this side of the membrane and fewer electrons on this side of the membrane. So this creates what we call membrane potential. As the electrons move through the electron transport chain proteins, they pump these protons across the membrane. When they get to photosystem 1, they get re-energized by more light from more light energy, and then they get passed through a second electron transport chain, and then off to NADP+, which you remember on that earlier diagram is the uncharged electron carrier, or the empty electron carrier, if you will. That, along with a proton, will give us that charged electron carrier, NADPH. That's going to go off to the Calvin cycle. And we're also using up protons on this side of the membrane by forming these molecules. And really, there's one thing left to do. We now have a surplus of protons on one side of the membrane. We have not as many protons on this side of the membrane, a deficiency of protons. So that creates what we call membrane potential. And that energy, that potential energy that's there, can be used, if it's harnessed in the right way, to do things, to do work. And in this case, we can harness that proton energy and use it with the help of a molecule called ATP synthase to generate ATP from molecules of ADP and inorganic phosphate. And again, we saw these on the top of that cycle on that earlier diagram, and then ATP coming out on the bottom of that diagram. So the ins and outs of this is that we have water coming in and we have light coming in, and through a set of complex reactions that pump protons across the thylakoid membrane and pass those electrons off to electron carriers, we end up with charged electron carriers and ATP. So as long as the sun is shining and as long as there's water around, that reaction will continue. When the sun goes down or the light is removed, that reaction will stop. And then eventually the second part of the reaction will slow down and stop as it runs out of ATP and NADPH. The next step is the Calvin cycle, where we take those ATP molecules and those NADPH molecules and we use the energy that they have in them to turn a low energy carbon compound, carbon dioxide, into a higher energy carbon compound, glucose. And this takes place during the carbon cycle or through the carbon cycle. And here I think it's important to keep track of numbers, the numbers of carbon, to see how this reaction is working. Because if you just look at the way things play out without keeping track of the numbers, it gets a little confusing. So here we have 6 5-carbon compounds called RUBP. So we have a total of 30 carbon atoms right here, 6 times 5. And then into our cycle, we have 6 carbon dioxide molecules coming in. So those are 6 more carbon atoms. And then we have some water too that will form our carbohydrates as we go through this reaction. And what happens between the beginning of this cycle at about 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock is that those molecules reconfigure themselves into 12 3-carbon compounds called PGA. And if you do the math, you had 30 and 6 here, that's 36. 12 times 3 is 36. So anytime you see ATP coming into a reaction and ADP coming out, that's a sign that energy is being deposited into the system. Same thing with these high energy electrons, NADPH going in, NADP plus coming out. So energy is going into this system. So even though it doesn't look like on this level, there's a lot happening. We go from 3-carbon compounds to 3-carbon compounds. The chemical potential energy of G3P is higher than the chemical potential energy of PGA. So we're going through that process of adding energy into our molecules to create glucose. Now, 2 of those G3Ps are going to cycle out, and they'll be used to make 6-carbon glucose. So there's 6 of our carbons going out, 2 of these to make 1 6-carbon glucose. And then the 10 G3Ps that are left over, again, take a little bit more energy from the light-dependent reactions and reassemble themselves into that RUBP model, or molecule rather, that we saw earlier at the beginning of the reaction. And that keeps the cycle going. So in all of these cycles, we'll see that there is a need to conserve the cycle by regenerating the first chemical that's used in the cycle itself. And this is definitely a good example of that. So again, when we take a look at that overall picture that we looked at in the beginning, we see that the light-dependent reactions are using light to break up water molecules to get electrons that they use to pump protons across this thylakoid membrane, and those protons can be used to make ATP. Also, the electrons ultimately, will get passed off to an electron carrier called NADP+, and that produces NADPH. And both of these higher energy molecules are used to fuel the Calvin cycle, which is able to turn a low energy carbon compound in the form of CO2 into a high energy carbon compound in the form of glucose. The other products of this reaction would be the ADP, that half charged battery that we talked about earlier in the unit, and NADP+. So they'll cycle back to the light dependent reactions and get remade into ATP and NADPH. So that is how photosynthesis works. Stay tuned for future installments where we'll take a look at aerobic respiration.